Our speaker for this hour is Brother Aaron Johnson from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And that seems so strange to me because it was just not long ago that he was here as one of our students. He's a 2018 graduate of Bear Valley and a tremendous student, great mind, graduated at the top of his class, just has so many abilities and talents, and but above all, he is so humble and he loves the Lord. He's dedicated to his cause, and we are so happy that he and Jacqueline, I know the Payne family is ecstatic that they're back here as well, and to get to visit just a bit. But we were delighted when Aaron first came to the Future Preacher Training Camp here, all the way from Canada. Now, that's outside of the United States for all of us that live down in Texas. But what a long ways to come even to Colorado from Canada. But it's a reminder of the importance and the value of this preacher training camp that we have. So young men, just remember, if you come here, you'll get a good Bible education, you'll get a job right away, and you'll get a wife when you come here today. So we're looking forward, Aaron, to this great lesson. We appreciate you being here. Come and preach.
What if I told you that the possibility of God's existence implied God's actual existence? That is to say that in order to prove that God actually exists, all you would have to do was demonstrate that God's existence was merely possible. Well, that is the claim of the ontological argument. The ontological argument for God's existence. It is my contention in this lecture that based on the possibility of God and what we mean by God, it is reasonable to believe that God actually does exist. Now, some think that it's too good to be true, and so they dismiss the argument out of hand. But ontological arguments have seen a resurgence in recent years, and most notably, Dr. Alvin Plantinga has defended a version of the ontological argument using something called modal logic. And so it is called the modal ontological argument for God's existence. And that is the argument that I will be defending today. Now, before we worry about what modal logic is, allow me just to briefly refresh our memories as to what makes for a good argument. A good argument has two components. It has a claim, and then it has evidence to support that claim. Now, the evidence are called the premises. And the premises naturally lead, or are supposed to naturally lead, to the conclusion. Now, in order for an argument to be a good one, what you want to have happen is you want to have happen a sound argument. So what makes for a sound argument? Well, there are two criteria that you have to meet in order to have a sound argument. First, you need to have true premises. Okay, so for this particular argument that we have for illustration, the premises are obviously true. All men are mortal. Human beings have been dying for millennium. Socrates is a man. For all we know, Socrates was indeed a human being. And so the premises are true, and it is obviously valid, right? The conclusion follows seamlessly from the premises. All A are B, and then you have C is A, therefore C is B. It's obviously logically valid, and so the argument is what we call sound. Logical validity plus true premises equals a sound argument. So as we enter into our discussion of the ontological argument, remember to be testing it against these two conditions. Now, I mentioned modal logic. Modal logic helps us think about the nature of things like possibility, impossibility, and necessity. For instance, what does it mean for something to be possible? What does it mean for something to be impossible or necessary? What does necessary even mean? Well, these are the kinds of questions that modal logic tries to answer. But in order to make any use out of modal logic, we first have to understand the language of possible worlds. Possible worlds. Some people get off to the wrong foot when we introduce the terminology of possible worlds because their mind goes to some kind of strange alternate dimension or multiple universes or something like that. Maybe we've read comic books or seen movies where the characters visit an alternate timeline, right? Or they travel to a different universe. Okay, get that out of your mind, because that's nothing like what we're talking about. We're not talking about actual worlds. We're talking about possible worlds. And a possible world is just a way in which reality could have been. A way in which reality could have been. And when we talk about world, we're not just talking about the earth. We're actually talking about the whole description of reality. Every facet of no matter how drastic or obscure. And so when you start to think about all the different facets of reality and how they could be different, you start to realize that there are any number of these possible worlds. For instance, you could have worn different clothes today, right? That would be possible. The clothes that you are wearing could have been a different color. That is a way in which the world could have been. Now let's consider a little more drastic change. The Milky Way galaxy could have been the only galaxy that exists, right? That's a way in which the world could have been. And so, in some possible world, only the Milky Way galaxy exists. Consider another one. In some possible world, only God exists. Right? Because God was under no compulsion to create anything, was he? He has free will. He could have chosen not to create something. And so, in some possible world, only God exists. But again, don't get bogged down with the terminology, right? We're not saying in some strange actual world that we could theoretically travel to and interact with, only God exists. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that in some possible description of reality, it is true to say that only God exists. And so when we're thinking about something that is possible, we're thinking about something, conditions that could be true in some possible world or possible worlds, plural. But if that's what we mean by possible, then it's not difficult to figure out what we mean by impossible. If something is possible because those conditions are true in some possible world, we can understand something to be impossible if those conditions are not true in any possible world. There is no possible description of reality in which these conditions are true. Think about a married bachelor. There is no possible world in which a married bachelor exists. It's impossible. Likewise, if you were to draw a straight line on a piece of paper, right? And then you were to draw a second line 90 degrees to the other one, it would be impossible for you to draw a third line that was perpendicular to the other two. You couldn't do it because it's impossible. You cannot draw three two-dimensional lines, each of which is perpendicular to the other two. There is no possible world in which those things exist, and so we say it is impossible. On the other side of the coin, you have those things that are necessary. Things that are necessary are those conditions that are true in every possible world. Think of a mathematical equation, something as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. That is true in every possible world. There is no possible world in which 2 + 2 = 4 is false. And so that truth is necessary. You could also think of certain metaphysical truths. For instance, out of nothing, nothing comes. In other words, you cannot get being from non-being. It's impossible. And so the phrase, out of nothing, nothing comes, is necessarily true. So you have, on one hand, possible, and then you have impossible and necessary. But lest you think that we are out of the woods yet, we have one more term that we need to clarify. If you were to look at the equation on the screen, and don't pull out your smartphones and try to calculate it, don't think too hard, because it's actually better if you don't know the answer. If you were to just look at that equation, would you say that it is true or false? Well, I mean, it could be true, or it could be false, for all I know, right? I mean, so for all we know, it is possibly true and possibly false. And that's a perfectly legitimate way to describe your view of that equation, if you understand that you are merely talking about something called epistemic possibility. Epistemic possibility. That is to say, possibly true and possibly false for all I know. It's a knowledge claim. However, in a stronger sense, in what is called a metaphysical sense, the equation really is only true or false. Right? So it would be perfectly fine to say that it's possibly true and possibly false for all we know, but the equation metaphysically is only possibly true or possibly false. So when we're talking about God's existence, a lot of people stop short at epistemic possibility. They say, well, I mean, God's existence is possible, but I mean, his non-existence is also possible, for all I know. But when we're talking about modal logic, when we're talking about the modal ontological argument for God's existence, we are never epistemic possibility. We don't want to hear about your inability to know if something is possible or not. We want to know if it actually is possible. We want to know if in some possible world this equation is actually true, if it's metaphysically possible. So now that we have our feet underneath us, let's lay eyes on this argument, because up until this point we've just been reviewing terms: possible, impossible, necessary, possible world, epistemic possibility, metaphysical possibility. Now that we have all of these terms rattling around in our brain, let's actually look at this argument. Premise 1, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. Okay, now you'll notice I use the word maximally great being, that phrase, instead of God. Ontological arguments typically refer to God in this way, just to make things simpler. So don't worry about that too much, because we're going to talk about what makes for a maximally great being in just a moment. But right now we're just trying to get a sense of the argument. So premise 1, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. Premise 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world, just by definition, right? I mean, we're not saying, in some strange actual world that a maximally great being exists. No, we're saying that in some possible description of reality, it is true to say that a maximally great being exists. Premise 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then this being exists in every possible world. Premise 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then this being exists in the actual world. Premise 5, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then this being exists, and therefore the conclusion would follow, therefore, a maximally great being exists. There's the argument. Now, remember those two conditions that I told you to test it against. Let's take validity first. This argument is obviously logically valid. It passes that test with flying colors, right? Each premise builds on the other, and it leads seamlessly into the conclusion. And so as far as validity is concerned, the argument passes with flying colors. The only other condition that needs to be met is for the premises to be true. Now, usually when someone is exposed to this argument for the first time, they experience kind of a disconnect, if I can understate what might be happening. When people try to look for the disconnect, they typically point the finger at premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being exists in every possible world. There's something just, it seems off about this argument, so what can we do to resolve this issue? Well, buckle up, because this might get a little wild. Let's go back to our equation. We need to remember how possible worlds work in relation to possibility and necessity and impossibility. And so just imagine, if you would, a clear glass bowl of water. That clear glass bowl of water is surrounded by innumerable vials of colored dye. Okay, now the water molecules in that bowl are going to represent possible worlds. Okay, so that total collection of possible worlds there is contained within that bowl. Now that would mean that one of those molecules is the actual world, right? Because this is a possible world. If it were impossible, we wouldn't be here. So the actual world molecule is in that bowl. Now those vials, on their labels, have propositions or statements that are either possible, impossible, or necessary. So for instance, let's say you took a vial of green dye that read, only the creation does not exist, or only God exists. And so you pour that into the bowl, and what you would see is an isolated cloud of green water hovering there in the bowl, right? Because it would be true of some possible worlds, but not all possible worlds. Now, what if you were to take a vial of yellow dye that read 2 + 2 = 4? You were to drop that in the bowl, what would happen? Well, the whole bowl would turn yellow, right? Because that's a necessary truth. Mathematical equations are the kinds of things that are necessarily true. So you pour the yellow dye in, and the whole bowl turns yellow. But what about something that's impossible? What if you had a red vial that was labeled, John is a married bachelor? You were to pour that into the bowl, what would you see? You'd see nothing. It would just remain clear, right? Because there is no possible world in which John is a married bachelor. Now, the temptation is to think of the actual world as kind of having priority, right? That the dye hits that world first and then slips off onto the other water molecules. But there is actually no reason to give the actual world priority in these types of things. So, let's go back to this equation. And at this point, you can plug it into your calculators. You can think about it. I'll just tell you, okay, the equation balances out at 100 = 100. So it's true. It's metaphysically possible. So let's say that we had a vial of dye that had this equation on it, right? If we were to pour that vial of dye and it were to hit the actual world first, right, you would see the whole bowl turn purple, because it's a necessary truth. If it's true in one possible world, then it's true in every possible world, right? But let's say that you didn't pour it on the actual world first, that you actually poured it on some possible non-actual world first. What would you see? Well, you would see the exact same result. It's just, it would start differently. So you see, there's no reason to start from the actual world and reason to the possible. You can start with the possible and reason to the actual just as legitimately, like we did with this equation. In fact, we can just plug this equation into our argument. So consider, it is possible that that equation is true. And remember, we're talking about metaphysical possibility. And mathematical equations, metaphysically possible mathematical equations, are the kinds of things that are necessarily true. So, it is possible that this equation is true. Premise 2. If it is possible that this equation is true, then it is true in some possible world. Premise 3. If this equation is true in some possible world, then it is true in every possible world. Just like with the dye hitting the bowl, if that equation was true, then it was necessarily true. And so as soon as it hit one world, it spread to the others. So if it's true in one possible world, then it's true in every possible world. But the next premise, if this equation is true in every possible world, then it's true in the actual world, and the conclusion would follow, therefore this equation is true. So it's kind of a roundabout way of thinking, but it's legitimate. But you'll notice that premise 3 is nearly identical to premise 3 in the ontological argument for God's existence. But now we understand how this is working. We understand that mathematical equations are the kinds of things that are either necessary or impossible. If they're metaphysically possible, then they're necessary. If they're not metaphysically possible, then they're impossible. So now that we understand that we can reason in this way, let's turn our attention back to the actual argument that we're considering. Here's the premise 3 for the ontological argument, and you'll notice that it's virtually identical. That if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then this being exists in every possible world. Now, if we think about what the kind of thing that a maximally great being is, then I think we can come to the conclusion rather naturally that this must be the case. Right? Imagine a being who is responsible for the creation of one possible world. And then imagine a second being that was responsible for the creation of 10 possible worlds. Which one's greater? Well, it would be the being that was responsible for the creation of 10 possible worlds, wouldn't it? That would be greater. So if you agree with that, then you would have to agree that the maximally great being would be responsible for the creation of every possible world. And if you denied that he was responsible for the creation of every possible world, then you're just saying that maximal greatness is not possible, because a maximally great being would have to be responsible for the creation of every possible world. And so if this maximally great being exists in even one possible world, then by definition, he has to exist in every possible world. Now that we have that understanding, you might be surprised to know that the only really controversial premise in this argument is premise 1, that it is possible for a maximally great being to exist. Because, as you've seen, if you properly understand what a maximally great being is, then once you grant his possible existence, then he spreads to the rest of the bowl. And so in order to deny the argument, because the premises fall like dominoes, you've got to stop the chain somewhere. And the critics, in our case, go after premise 1. So since this is the controversial premise, it does us some good to have some idea of what we mean by maximally great. And once we have some idea of what a maximally great being is, to understand some of the objections to the definition. A maximally great being is defined as one that possesses all great-making properties to the highest degree in every possible world. A being that possesses all great-making properties to the highest degree in every possible world. So what are great-making properties, you might ask? Well, excellent question. The great-making properties would be those classical attributes that are typically ascribed to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That would be omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection. So if that is how a maximally great being is defined, and the critic wants to go after premise 1, then what is the critic's strategy? The critic's strategy is to try and show that a maximally great being is just like a married bachelor. Because a married bachelor, the problem with that kind of thing is that it possesses two characteristics that are logically contradictory. Right? You would have to say that John is married and unmarried at the same time and in the same sense. But that's logically contradictory. And so what the critic tries to do is say, hey, look, you say that this maximally great being is omnipotent and morally perfect, but those two are contradictory. Or else they try to show that something like omnipotence is itself incoherent, that it doesn't even make sense. So let's try and briefly go through some of these objections. When we're talking about omnipotence, sometimes it is understood as the ability to do anything. The ability to do anything. And so the critic says, okay, well, you say that this maximally great being can do anything. Can he create a square circle? Could this being make a box that was bigger on the inside than it was on the outside? Right? Because anything would include logical impossibilities, wouldn't it? And so if omnipotence implies the ability to do anything, and this anything is actually impossible, then you can't be omnipotent. So it's actually a good way to argue if it goes through. The problem is omnipotence does not mean the ability to do anything. Rather, omnipotence is a compound word, comes from two different words, omni and potence. Omni means all, right? You can be a carnivore, you can be an herbivore, or you can be an omnivore. You eat everything, all. So omni, all, potence, power. Not the ability to do anything, rather, the ability to do anything that requires power. And power cannot accomplish logical impossibilities. Doesn't matter how strong you are, I guarantee you won't be able to draw a square circle. It's not a limit of power, it's just impossible. And so omnipotence does not mean anything. It means anything that can be done with power. So there's no incoherence there. But then there's a second, perhaps more popular objection. And they say, well, if God is omnipotent, then could God create a stone so big that he himself could not lift it? It's a good question, seems like. I mean, if God is all-powerful, then he should be able to create the stone, right? If he can't do it, then he's not omnipotent. But then if he actually creates the stone and then he can't lift it, well, then he's not omnipotent. Heads I win, tails you lose. So how do we navigate this? Well, as Greg Kokel observes, this is a misunderstanding of the idea of competition. Competition only makes sense when there are two parties involved. Okay, so let's say that we took the greatest boxer in the world, got him up on stage here, and his job was to beat himself in a fight. I'm not talking about him fighting a clone of himself. No, I'm just talking about himself, his two fists, duking it out. Who's going to win? Well, it doesn't make sense, does it? You see, the question basically reduces to this. Could God's power defeat his power? But that doesn't even make sense. Just like you couldn't beat yourself in a fight. You can't beat yourself in an arm wrestle. So it's a confusion of what competition really means. It sounds like a good question, but it's actually just nonsense. It's just nonsense. So it's not a legitimate objection. There's no incoherence there with omnipotence. Well, we have to keep moving. What about omniscience? Omniscience is defined as all-knowing. All-knowing. Sometimes an objection is leveled because knowledge is confused with experience. You see, if you take knowledge to be equal to experience, then in order to know everything, what's the implication? You would have to experience everything, right? So in order for God to know what skydiving was like, he would have to go skydiving. In order for God to know everything, he would have to experience everything. But that would include the committing of all sorts of moral atrocities, wouldn't it? God would have to experience that. However, that would be incompatible with moral perfection. Married bachelor. However, knowledge does not imply experience. Rather, God's omnipotence has almost always, it's classically been defined as knowing the truth value of all propositions. Knowing the truth value of all propositions. So if you could imagine all of reality, and then think of all of the propositions that it would take to describe every feature of reality. So, Aaron exists. The earth revolves around the sun. The shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. Right? And you just went through and you listed every single feature of reality in terms of a proposition. God's omniscience means that God knows the truth value of all those propositions. But notice that this propositional knowledge does not imply experience. And so when we're talking about God's omniscience, we're not talking about him experiencing everything. We're just talking about him knowing the truth value of all of these propositions. And so there is no contradiction. But finally, what about moral perfection? Moral perfection. The Christian runs into an interesting problem here because the Christian believes that God cannot lie. Right? Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18, in which it is impossible for God to lie. But wait a second. You just told me that God possesses omnipotence, didn't you? You just told me that God could accomplish anything that requires power, and now you're telling me that God can't even tell a little teeny-weeny lie? That sounds like a contradiction to me. Well, the confusion here is where you misplace the emphasis. See, the emphasis here is not on God's power, but rather on God's goodness. You see, it is not as though God is not powerful enough to tell a lie. Rather, God is too good to tell a lie. So God's power, the amount of God's power, has not changed one iota. The only difference is now God is too good to use that power to commit immoralities. So it's not a comment on his omnipotence. His omnipotence hasn't diminished at all. It's just that he's too good to use his omnipotence in immoral ways. Right? We don't consider the villain to be greater than the hero because they go around lying, stealing, cheating, and murdering. Rather, we consider the hero to be greater because they will not do these things. Even though they could, right? They had sufficient power. Well, greater still is the being who cannot commit immorality. So taken together, these three properties, omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, make up this maximally great being. And there is no obvious contradiction between the properties, and there's no obvious incoherence with any one property. And so it would follow, therefore, a maximally great being is possible. But if a maximally great being is possible, then the conclusion would follow, therefore, God exists. Given premise one, given the truth of premise one, the remaining premises of the argument fall with relative ease. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world, by definition. But if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then in virtue of him being the maximally great being, he would have to exist in every possible world. Again, by definition. But if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then he exists in the actual world. And if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. So if maximally great being is possible, then a maximally great being exists. There is one more point of clarification that is necessary, and that is that in order to feel the force of the argument, you do not necessarily have to agree with my particular characterization of maximal greatness or even moral perfection. In fact, some people would adamantly disagree with my characterization of moral perfection. There's lots of disagreement on that. However, even if you disagree with my particular characterization of maximal greatness, you still have to deal with the argument. Imagine that you were about to sit down and you were going to have some lunch, so you get everything ready, you warm it up, and you're about to take the first bite, and your friend runs up to you and slaps the fork away and says, "Don't eat anything." And he then proceeds to give you an argument to convince you that your food has been poisoned. Okay, so you're listening, and you're actually convinced by his argument, right? You buy the reasoning. However, you disagree with the particular kind of poison that your friend suggested that had contaminated your food. You say, "Look, I buy your argument, but I think that he used a completely different kind of poison." Are you then free to eat your lunch? Well, no, you're still committed to the same conclusion, even though the particular was different. Likewise, each person has some idea of what moral perfection is. Each person has some idea of maximal greatness. And if they personally believe that their version of maximal greatness is possible, then just like they believed that their food had been poisoned, they are committed to the same conclusion. So it's actually even stronger than we first realized. The question is, do you believe that God's existence is possible, metaphysically? Because if you believe that God's existence is possible, then you must believe that God exists, given the truth of the ontological argument. That would be to say that unless you believed that God's existence was actually impossible, then you must believe that God exists. Unless God's existence is impossible, God exists, according to the ontological argument. But as we have seen, it is possible that God exists. Therefore, God exists. Thank you.